Composers and creators, it's Heyde, and today I'm going to show you how we went from this MIDI monstrosity over to the lush sounds of the Northern Film Orchestra. I've really been looking forward to this video for a while. Jack Hughes, who is the founder of the Northern Film Orchestra, had contacted me several months back during quarantine. We talked for a bit, we ran a couple of Zoom meetings, and we decided that we'd like to do this kind of collaboration where I talk about how you orchestrate from strings and some of the differences that you can see between your mock-up and the finished product. To prepare for this video, I created a short composition entitled Amber Meadows, as well as a couple variations that showcase some different orchestrations. We'll be taking a quick look at the mock-up first in Logic to get an idea of how it sounded, and then we'll move over to the real orchestra, the Northern Film Orchestra, who recorded this at Stoller Hall over the course of about 30 minutes. So I hope this video can be helpful to composers looking to work with more live musicians in the future, and be sure to give the Northern Film Orchestra some love at the end of the video by checking them out in the description. Without further ado, let's jump in. Okay, so first things first, let's take a look at the piece. Now, I originally composed this at the piano. I'm a pianist myself, and I'm gonna play you the kind of piano mock-up so you can get an idea of how it sounded before I orchestrated it. Okay, so you'll see I used some moderately complex harmonies, and that was deliberate. I wanted to see how that would translate over from the mock-up to the real players. And the tempo is kind of upbeat. We've got something kind of bouncy. Now, this was nowhere near a complete sketch, so what I then had to do was actually translate it to each individual instrument. So if I go back a step, you'll see that I now have a split between all of the orchestra, and this is what we wound up having. I'm gonna play the finished product and then just briefly touch through how I actually orchestrated it. Okay, so I'm using Cinematic Studio Strings, which is a very lush, kind of large sound. One thing to keep in mind is that translating over to the Northern Film Orchestra, I was aware that they were going to be working with a much, much smaller ensemble. We're working with like a chamber size ensemble, so some of the things that we do in terms of divises will probably be very weak sounding, and so we have to be very cautious about that. You'll see in the way that I orchestrated some of the variations how that can be demonstrated. So first things first, the violin is pretty much just doing the melody all the way through. Not too much to say about that. There is a harmonic at the beginning, which I was interested to see how that would translate as well. Then we basically have some couplings between violin 2 and viola. As the piece begins, they're kind of playing a little duo kind of passage, staccato. And then when it comes to the inner harmony, they're actually alternating. See, it looks like they're just playing repeated notes, but if I actually press these notes, you'll see that they're alternating. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And the viola is doing the exact opposite. This creates some motion without having things feel short. So it creates this ability for them to play legato, but also to be able to kind of have a little bit of motion happening inside of those inner harmonies. I'll be isolating these things with the actual orchestra so you can hear this in action. In the beginning of the piece, you also have cello and contrabass that are kind of working as a unit, pretty much playing things in octaves, which is standard. As the piece continues, we have pizzicato bass, and we have cello sustaining some of the bass lines. So that's a common technique. John Williams uses that quite a bit. And the effect that you get is some punctuation in the bass, while also having something kind of static and sustained in the actual bass line. Now, around halfway through of this piece, we move from kind of the more rhythmic elements of the accompaniment to a more sustained kind of thing. So now cello, violin 2, viola, they're all working as a three-part unit, kind of cascading upwards and downwards together. The effect is a bit more romantic and kind of lush sounding. And then at the end of the piece, they move back to that original texture, and we settle back down on an open voice triad. So now let's introduce the Northern Film Orchestra, and I'm also including a score in the video description if you'd like to check that out and kind of read along. Their ensemble size here is 7 violins, 2 violas, 2 celli, and 1 bass, which is going to affect the divises in some of the later variations, but for now it's not affecting too much, other than the overall sound. You'll notice that compared to cinematic studio strings, of course, this sound is much more intimate, but as a result kind of has a bit more of a kind of classical, chambery feel. You'll also notice too that the performance was a bit slower than the Logic project. The reason for that is that I wanted to see what would happen if we worked without a click. So I had Melvin, our conductor, conduct the piece just freely, whatever tempo he thought was appropriate, somewhere around 130. What tends to happen with strings is when there is no click track, because it takes a little bit of time to actually generate a sound on the bow, strings tend to drag a little bit. And so if you're working without click, just be aware that you may have a slightly slower performance than what you intended. If you want a very accurate performance, go straight to click. Now let's pick apart that violin 2 and viola to see in the intro how they interact back and forth. Okay, so again, if you're quantizing in Logic, you're gonna hear these things land perfectly, and with some of the shorter passages, and especially pizzicato, you'll notice that with real performance, you should expect it to be slightly off. For me, I like that. It's what gives it that kind of humanistic sound, and it just kind of fills in the sound in a broader way as opposed to everything just syncopating perfectly on the beat. The way that I tried to add interest between those two parts was having them alternate. So you notice that the violas kind of come in on every and of the beat, whereas the violin 2s come in on the downbeats. There's also some legato passages interspersed with the short passages, and that just helps add a little bit of textural variety in there. Now let's take a look at the 2 sustain lines, the violin 1 playing the melody, and the cello playing the bass, and see how they interact. So you notice that one thing I'm trying to do is when the melody is active, I try to keep the bass static. And the reverse is true too. When the melody is static, I try to get the bass moving a little bit. In that way, it doesn't cloud the melody. You can still hear the melody very clearly, but it also fills in some of the empty space when the melody comes to rest. Lastly, let's just look at measure 25 when the cello kind of has a little bouncing passage and the bass just kind of supports it with some occasional pizzicatos. So you'll see the bass is sometimes separated by the octave, and sometimes they actually converge in the middle to be playing in unisons. But the effect is that percussive kind of bounce you get from the pizzicato bass. So you'll notice for this theme that I created a lot of inner movement in the harmonies to kind of create the sense of momentum and pushing forward. But what would happen if I actually just sustained all of the parts, just have them kind of moving as a unit together? So our next variation is going to showcase that, and I'm going to play that now so you can hear it. So you'll notice the effect is much more romantic and expressive. Where the bass was playing pizzicatos before, it's now actually playing sustains. And everywhere that the melody moves, the harmony kind of moves along to support it. So as the melody rises, the harmony too rises, and as it falls, they fall. And the effect you get is that they're one big unit. Let's take another listen without the melody so you can hear all of those inner parts and how they move together. Now, the way you can accomplish that sort of writing is by focusing on this kind of harmonic movement, so these block triads, and then trying to infuse those triads with a little bit of movement inside. So sometimes that'll be as simple as adding a little suspension here and there. Sometimes the bass line, you want to kind of move down to the next note that it's going to. And if you can do that in a way that they're moving as a unit collectively, but have individual little moments that they stick out, you end up getting a really lush and beautiful sound. Now, we've kind of focused in on how we actually work with the harmonies, but what about the melody itself? So far, we've just had the melody being violin 1. So for the next variation, I tried including an extra part playing the melody and seeing how it affected both the melody and the accompaniment. In this variation, violin 1 and viola are playing the melody, which means that we need some extra support in the accompaniment. So violin 2 and cello are working as a unit, and pizzicato bass is a bit more active than it was in the previous variations. Let's give that a listen. Now, when talking about orchestration, we're always factoring in register. The viola is a good choice to double the violin an octave lower because the viola's register is slightly lower than that of the violin's. The violin has a low note of a G, and the viola actually can go a fifth lower than that to the C. So as a result, when the viola is playing an octave lower than the violin, it actually still sounds like they're both singing in the proper registers. You could make the comparison to a soprano singer and a tenor singer. Even though they're singing octaves apart, it still sounds balanced because, respective to their ranges, they're singing in about the same area. Let's hear the violin and the viola on their own to demonstrate that. Now, unlike violin 1 and viola, the violin 2 and cello are on slightly different registers. This is pushing the mids of the cello register and some of the lows of the violin register, so it should sound like the cello is a bit more dominant, although not overpoweringly so. Throughout most of that, they're working in sixths, which is a pleasant sound, and because they're not doing any contrary motion, it makes them feel like one solid unit. For the next variation, I wanted to take that exact idea and just invert it. So now we have viola and cello playing the melody, and we have violin 1 and 2 playing the accompaniment. Now you'll see the effect of that is that it's a bit darker and more subdued. We're working with a lower register for the melody, and it's kind of strained sounding almost in the cello and viola, but it can be a very useful effect if that's what you want emotionally. The viola and cello are again separated by the octave, which gives the melody a little bit more power and also keeps those two instruments balanced. The violin 1 and 2 are in a much lower register relative to their instruments, and so they kind of sit behind the viola and the cello. Finally, for the last variation, I wanted to see what would happen if we worked with a counterpoint in violin 2 and a divisi in the cellos. Again, remember the cello section only has 2 players, so we're literally working with 1 player per part. The effect should be that it sounds a little bit weaker, but maybe again more intimate because we're working with a very chamber setting. So let's hear how that sounds. So you'll notice there is a slight imbalance in some of the inner harmonies. That one solo cello just can't compete against the rest of the ensemble. Let's hear the cellos and the basses on their own. Again, you'll notice it's very bass dominant, so the bass has the support of the pizzicato, which is very resonant, as well as the cello sustain. That upper line, it's just on its own, and so it's going to sound the weakest out of the whole ensemble. Here's that same part again with the violas added in. Sometimes the way problems like this will be solved is by having multiple sections be divisi. So you could split the violas out and have the lower viola take on the same part as the upper cello. In that way, you're giving the section a little bit more support, but keep in mind you want your writing to work with the ensemble size that you have, not against it. So if you know you're working with a small ensemble, make sure your parts are streamlined and condensed, avoid writing too many divisi passages, and focus mostly on register, because register is where you're going to get the most resonance out of the ensemble. Now again, if you'd like to study these scores for yourself, I've included them in the video description so you can check them out. And if you find this kind of video helpful, please leave a like and comment below that you did, because we're considering doing more in the future and we'd love to get your feedback on the kinds of things that you'd like to learn more about. Another great way you can support me is by checking out my Patreon, which is also in the video description. I have a bunch of rewards for people who can join, including some long-form content, bonus videos, Q&As, and a monthly hangout that I do with all of my patrons. Again, I want to give a huge thank you to everybody involved in the Northern Film Orchestra. They did a wonderful job with my piece, and it was such a thrill hearing my music performed. Thank you all again so much for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and happy composing.